The emergency room was buzzing with its usual chaos, monitors beeping, stretchers rolling, doctors rushing from one patient to another. But amid all the controlled panic, something unusual was happening at the nurse's station. Everyone turned their eyes to see her, an ER nurse who'd been a quiet force of calm and competence in this hectic world. She had spent countless nights saving lives, soothing panicked families, and making sure no patient was overlooked. And yet, at this very moment, she was about to face the unthinkable. The hospital administrator, a man known for his rigid rules and quick temper, stood towering over her, his face a mask of authority. His voice cut through the room like a knife. "You're fired. Pack your things. Now." The words echoed off the sterile walls, silencing even the loudest beeps of the machines for a brief, heavy moment. Whispers began circulating among the staff. Shock, disbelief, confusion. No one had expected this. Not her colleagues, not the patients, and certainly not her. She slowly rose from her chair, her hands trembling slightly as she gathered her belongings. Her eyes met the gaze of the other nurses, some sympathetic, some stunned, some unsure how to react. The administrator continued his tirade, listing vague complaints, blaming her for minor mistakes, ignoring all the lives she had saved, all the dedication she had shown. And in that moment, it felt like the whole hospital was against her. As she walked toward the exit, each step echoed loudly in the hall, magnifying the humiliation. The staff tried to look away, some exchanging awkward glances, unable to intervene. Patients peeked curiously from behind curtains, sensing the tension. Outside, a storm had started to rumble, the rain tapping insistently against the windows, mirroring the turmoil inside the room. Little did anyone know this was not the end. Far from it. There was someone about to enter this hospital who could turn the tide completely. Someone whose presence alone commanded respect, fear, and awe. And the very fate of this nurse, her career, her dignity, and her chance for justice, was about to change in ways no one could anticipate. The doors of the ER slid open, and the camera panned slowly to the entrance. A tall, imposing figure stepped in, calm and deliberate, scanning the room with eyes that seemed to pierce right through the tension. And then, in a voice that carried the weight of experience and authority, he asked a single question. "Where is the nurse who saved my life?" As the question echoed through the room, all eyes shifted toward the nurse, who had paused mid-step. Her heart raced, a mix of disbelief and cautious hope flooding her. Could this really be happening? Was someone finally about to recognize her, the very person they had just humiliated? But before she could react, the administrator shot a sharp glance at her, trying to maintain control. "This is irrelevant," he muttered, his voice tight with unease. For years she had quietly dedicated herself to this hospital. She was the one who stayed late after double shifts, the one who held a panicked patient's hand when no one else had time. She remembered countless nights where she had administered life, saving care, often at the expense of her own rest and health. Families she had comforted would sometimes return with heartfelt thanks. But there were also those who never knew her name, never saw her dedication, and certainly never gave her the recognition she deserved. And yet, despite all of that, she had been punished, not for negligence, not for mistakes, but because someone higher up had felt threatened by her competence. Jealousy had a way of creeping into the hospital hierarchy, slowly poisoning good intentions, and today she was paying the price. The unfairness stung, but deep inside, a quiet fire still burned. She was not the type to surrender easily. Her colleagues watched silently, some too intimidated to speak, others struggling to hide their sympathy. One younger nurse, barely out of training, whispered under her breath, "She's the reason I even survived my first night on the floor." The words were barely audible, but they carried a weight that the administrator could not ignore. The nurse's influence had reached far beyond what anyone realized. Every action she took, every patient she had comforted, every life she had saved, it all added up to a legacy of quiet heroism that no firing could erase. And then came the flashbacks, brief but vivid, replaying in her mind. A patient struggling to breathe in the middle of the night, alone and terrified, and she had acted with calm precision to stabilize him. A soldier, wounded and bleeding, arriving at the ER after a covert mission, and she had been the one to keep him alive until more help arrived. Faces of gratitude, tearful thanks, and small gestures of human connection filled her memory. These were the moments that defined her, not the unfair accusations that had led to this humiliating dismissal. Yet, despite all her past heroics, fear lingered. Fear of losing her career, of walking away from the place she had devoted so much of her life to, of the judgmental eyes of administrators and co-workers who did not understand her sacrifices. But mingled with that fear was something else, hope. The hope that the man who had just entered the room, the figure whose presence seemed to command silence and respect, could change everything. He had called for her specifically. That meant something. That meant she wasn't alone in this fight. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her hands. Each beat of her heart echoed the same thought: she had to stand tall. She had to face this moment with courage. The rain outside tapped against the windows in a rhythm that matched her pulse, a quiet reminder that storms passed, and calm followed. And in that brief moment, as the camera captured her gaze meeting his, there was an unspoken understanding, a recognition that what was about to happen could rewrite not only her fate, but the course of the entire hospital. The staff watched, frozen in a mix of curiosity and fear. They had seen her as just another nurse, competent but replaceable. Today they were about to witness the truth. Today they would see that heroism often comes quietly, but its impact echoes far beyond what anyone can see. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to hope, not just for her job, but for recognition, for justice, and for the moment when someone powerful would finally see her for who she truly was. The room was quiet, save for the distant hum of monitors and the occasional shuffle of a nurse's shoes against the tile floor. The ER nurse stood frozen for a moment, her thoughts racing. She had faced many emergencies in her career, rushing to stabilize patients, making split-second decisions, comforting terrified families, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. Being publicly fired was humiliating, yes, but what weighed heavier was the injustice, the sheer unreasonableness of it all. Her mind drifted to the beginning of her career. She had always known that nursing was more than a job, it was a calling. The long hours, the physical exhaustion, the emotional strain, all of it had been worth it if she could save a life, calm a family, or prevent tragedy. From her first day in the ER, she had thrown herself into every task, every patient, every moment of responsibility. Her determination had earned the respect of some colleagues and the envy of others. And over the years, she had quietly built a record of heroism that few knew about. Flashbacks began to play vividly in her mind. She remembered the young boy who had come in with severe trauma after an accident. His parents were hysterical, crying and begging for him to survive. She had stayed by his side for hours, speaking gently, stabilizing him, monitoring his vitals, and ensuring that every action was precise and careful. By the end of the night, the boy had survived, and she had quietly slipped away, never seeking recognition, just satisfaction in knowing she had done her job. Then there was the mission she would never forget. A wounded soldier brought in late one night, barely conscious, the result of a dangerous operation overseas. He had been stabilized in minutes, thanks to her quick thinking and steady hands. The soldier had looked at her once, eyes filled with gratitude and a silent understanding of the life she had saved. That moment stayed with her unspoken, a memory of the quiet power she held when others doubted her abilities. Yet, her career had never been easy. The hospital hierarchy was filled with politics, jealousy, and petty rivalries. There were colleagues who resented her for being competent, administrators who dismissed her contributions, and staff who preferred to stay silent rather than challenge authority. Today, all of that had culminated in her firing. It wasn't just punishment. It was a statement meant to make others afraid to shine, to question, or to step beyond their assigned roles. She looked around the ER again, noticing subtle glances from some of the younger nurses who had quietly admired her for years. There was fear in some eyes, curiosity in others, and confusion in most. No one understood the full scope of her contributions, nor did they realize how indispensable she had become. The injustice of her dismissal weighed on her, but something else was stirring within, a flicker of resolve, a quiet defiance that refused to be silenced. And then she thought of the figure who had just entered the room, Steven Seagal. The very presence of someone so commanding, so respected gave her hope. Someone who had first-hand experience of her heroics, someone who knew her worth, had come to advocate for her. That hope, fragile but persistent, mingled with fear and anticipation. She wondered silently, could this truly be the moment when everything changes? Her thoughts were interrupted as the administrator moved closer, trying to regain control, his voice low and tight. "You've caused enough trouble. This is over. Leave." But before she could respond, her eyes met those of Seagal. There was calm authority, an expectation in his gaze, a reminder that someone knew her true value, that someone had seen her courage firsthand. At that moment, a subtle tension began to build in the room, thick enough to almost touch. Every nurse, every staff member, every patient seemed to sense that the next few minutes would change everything. It was more than a firing. It was a test of character, of justice, of courage. And in the silence before the storm, the audience, the viewers watching this story unfold, could feel it too, a creeping anticipation that something extraordinary was about to happen. Audience engagement moment. Pause here and ask yourself, if you were in her place, would you fight back or quietly accept the injustice? Think about it for a moment, because the answer matters. The nurse's mind raced further, recalling every small act that had defined her. The quiet nights of endless paperwork, the lives she had touched without recognition, the silent victories where her skill had meant the difference between life and death. And now, all of it had been overshadowed by a single, cruel act being dismissed publicly, belittled in front of colleagues, and forced to leave the place she had devoted herself to entirely. Yet, despite the humiliation, there was no surrender. She straightened her back, squared her shoulders, and took a slow, steadying breath. The storm outside, drumming against the windows, mirrored the storm inside her, but unlike the storm outside, she could control this one. She could choose to rise above the injustice, to face it with courage and dignity, and to see this through to the end. And with that, the stage was set. The tension in the ER was palpable. Every heartbeat, every glance, every unspoken thought carried the weight of what was about to unfold. The nurse, the administrator, the staff, and the powerful figure standing in the doorway. Each played a part in the story that was about to reach its tipping point. The audience, watching from the edge of their seats, could feel the suspense building, knowing that what came next would change everything. The ER suddenly shifted from routine chaos to urgent crisis. The calm monotony of the day was shattered by the arrival of a stretcher, rolling with alarming speed toward the trauma bay. Nurses and doctors moved instinctively, alert but tense. On the stretcher lay a man, clearly military, unconscious, covered in blood, his breathing labored and uneven. Alarms blared, and the medical staff sprang into action, but there was an unmistakable ripple of panic. This was no ordinary patient, every second counted, and the stakes were unimaginably high. The nurse froze for a moment, taking in the scene. Her firing earlier that day felt like a distant memory, compared to the immediate danger before her. Despite the humiliation, despite the injustice, her instincts kicked in. This was what she was trained for, what she had lived for, the ability to act when lives hung in the balance. She stepped forward, but the administrator's voice stopped her cold. "Stay back," he barked, his tone sharp, desperate to assert control. "You're off duty. This isn't your concern anymore." Her jaw tightened, and she met his gaze steadily. "I can save him," she said quietly but firmly. Her voice carried authority born from experience, an unspoken promise that she had done this countless times before. But the administrator shook his head, insisting she step aside. Other staff members hesitated, uncertain whom to obey. Every second was a fight against not just death but bureaucracy, against fear and misplaced pride. The patient's vitals were deteriorating rapidly, blood pressure dropping, oxygen levels plummeting, a faint pulse barely detectable. Nurses and doctors exchanged urgent whispers, scanning equipment, preparing to follow standard protocols. The nurse ignored them. Her mind worked quickly, calculating every action, anticipating every complication. She knelt beside the patient, checking his airway, stabilizing his neck, and preparing to administer critical interventions. Each movement was precise, each decision instantaneous. She had done this before in the battlefield, where mistakes meant permanent consequences. Here, the stakes were equally high, though the pressure came from within the hospital walls rather than enemy fire. Sweat glistened on her forehead, heart pounding, but her hands were steady. The room felt suspended in time. The monitor beeped in harsh, erratic bursts. The administrator paced nervously, glancing toward the doorway where Steven Seagal stood, observing silently. His expression was unreadable, but there was a glimmer of acknowledgement in his eyes, recognition that this nurse was the one capable of handling the situation. She worked with calm authority, guiding the other staff with quick instructions, making sure every move was coordinated. A nurse hesitated before inserting an IV, and she stepped in seamlessly, guiding the needle with expert precision. Oxygen was administered, vital signs monitored, bleeding controlled. Every action she took pushed the patient closer to stability. The audience watching could almost feel the tension building. Would she succeed? Would the administrator finally recognize her skill before it was too late? The camera would linger on her focused expression, on the steady hands moving with absolute confidence, contrasting sharply with the panic around her. Minutes passed, each one stretching into an eternity. The patient's vitals stabilized slightly, but not enough. The room held its collective breath, and then the nurse looked up, eyes meeting Seagal's across the room. There was no need for words. He knew what she had accomplished. He had seen her competence firsthand, and his presence alone seemed to bolster her resolve. But the suspense wasn't over. Just as she prepared for the next critical step, the monitor began beeping rapidly again. Another complication. The patient's condition was worsening, and the administrator froze, unsure how to intervene. It was a defining moment. Would she rise above all obstacles, bureaucracy, humiliation, and the odds and save the life before her? The audience was left on the edge of their seats, their hearts racing alongside hers. Every action, every decision, every movement mattered. The storm outside mirrored the intensity inside, rain pelting the windows, a low rumble of thunder adding dramatic weight to the unfolding crisis. The nurse's hands moved swiftly, decisively, each action deliberate, each breath measured, and in the background, Seagal's eyes never left her, silently communicating trust and support. In that suspended, high-stakes moment, the audience felt it too, the tension, the suspense, the anticipation. Could she save the man in critical condition? Could she prove, once and for all, that her skill, courage, and dedication were undeniable, despite the injustice she had endured? The next move would determine not only the patient's fate, but the outcome of the confrontation that had been quietly brewing since her firing. The ER seemed to hold its breath. The chaos of the emergency, the flashing monitors, the frantic shuffling, the beeping alarms, suddenly felt suspended in time. Every eye turned to the entrance as the doors slid open slowly, the sound echoing across the sterile hall. And then he appeared. Steven Seagal, tall, calm, and commanding. He moved with an authority that immediately cut through the tension. His presence was magnetic, a figure who required attention without demanding it. He didn't rush, he didn't panic. He scanned the room with deliberate focus, taking in the frantic activity, the worried faces of staff, the nurse who had been recently fired, but was now kneeling over the critically injured patient. The administrator straightened instinctively, his composure faltering slightly under Seagal's gaze. The aura of control that had governed the hospital for weeks now seemed insignificant. He opened his mouth to speak, to assert his authority, but no words came. Seagal's eyes were fixed on the nurse, unwavering, as if measuring the weight of her courage and skill against the injustice she had endured. Then, with quiet but undeniable authority, he asked the question that would change everything. "Where is the nurse who saved my life?" The room went silent again, every heartbeat amplified. The nurse froze, hands still on the patient, eyes lifting to meet his. She had saved him months ago, in circumstances she had long since buried in her memory. But the reality of recognition, of acknowledgement from someone of his stature, hit her like a jolt of electricity. Her lips parted, but words failed her for a brief, precious moment, and that's when the tension became electric. The administrator, sensing the shift in power, tried to interject. "Sir, she's not authorized." Seagal's gaze shifted sharply toward him. His voice, calm but edged with steel, cut through the tension. "I don't care about authorization. She saved my life. That alone makes her invaluable." The nurse's hands, which had been steady moments before, trembled slightly, not from fear but from the realization that justice might finally be within reach. Other staff members watched in awe, some leaning in as if to catch every word, every gesture, every silent acknowledgement of her competence. She stepped back briefly from the patient, taking a deep breath, feeling a mix of adrenaline, relief, and incredulity. The audience watching would feel it too, the shock, the anticipation, the emotional swell of seeing the underdog finally recognized. Audience engagement moment. Pause and ask yourself, if someone came to defend you in the face of unfair treatment, how would you react? Would you believe it, or would doubt creep in first? Seagal's presence was more than symbolic. He began giving calm, precise instructions, guiding the staff around the patient while acknowledging the nurse's expertise. His tone was firm but respectful, an acknowledgement that she was the one who had the skill, the courage, and the composure to handle the crisis. The administrator's face fell as he realized that his power, based solely on title, was meaningless in comparison to real skill and courage. Staff who had hesitated now moved decisively, following Seagal's lead. But it was clear that the nurse was the true authority in the room when it came to the patient's survival. Every moment was cinematic. The camera would linger on Seagal's calm assessment, the nurse's steady hands, the tension of the other staff who had doubted her, and the critical patient whose life depended on their coordinated effort. Rain pounded against the windows, a thunderclap resonating like the heartbeat of the moment. It wasn't just a medical emergency, it was a reckoning of courage, justice, and recognition. The nurse's eyes met Seagal's again, and in that silent exchange, a promise was made. Her dedication had not gone unnoticed, her skill could not be denied, and the storm of injustice that had threatened to consume her career was beginning to break. And as the audience would watch, the suspense built to the tipping point. Would the patient survive? Would the administrator finally acknowledge the truth? Would the nurse's career be restored? The answers were within reach but not yet revealed. The tension remained, a cliffhanger that kept viewers on the edge of their seats, hungry for the next part of the story. The emergency room had settled into a tense rhythm. Yet the weight of the moment pressed on everyone in the room. The critically injured patient was stable for now, thanks to the nurse's skill, but the atmosphere crackled with anticipation. Every staff member, from the youngest trainee to the administrator, seemed to sense that what was about to unfold was bigger than the medical emergency. It was a reckoning. Steven Seagal stood calmly, his presence commanding, eyes fixed on the administrator. The nurse, though still catching her breath, felt a quiet surge of confidence. His arrival had already shifted the balance of power, but now he was ready to reveal the truth that had been overlooked for far too long. "You need to understand," Seagal began, his voice firm, yet calm, cutting through the lingering tension. "This nurse is not just skilled. She saved my life." The administrator's face twisted in disbelief, a mix of anger and confusion. "What are you talking about?" he asked, voice rising, a futile attempt to regain control. "This is a hospital, not some battlefield." "Her actions." Seagal's gaze was unwavering. "Her actions saved me during a mission overseas. She stabilized critical injuries under circumstances that would have broken most people. If she hadn't acted with precision and courage, I wouldn't be standing here today." The nurse felt a wave of validation wash over her. She had never sought recognition for her battlefield service or the countless lives she had saved. She had acted because it was the right thing to do, not because anyone would notice. Yet here, in the middle of the hospital she had devoted her life to, someone powerful and respected was acknowledging her bravery, publicly, undeniably. Staff exchanged glances, the room buzzing with quiet murmurs. Some remembered the nights she had stayed behind to ensure patients were cared for. Others realized that the panic earlier wasn't her failure. It was the administrator's refusal to recognize her authority. Slowly, the reality settled in: the nurse had been wronged, and it was being corrected before their eyes. The administrator stammered, trying to defend himself. I didn't know." His voice trailed off, the power in the room no longer his own. Authority alone could not override the truth. He had punished her for reasons that now seemed petty, almost absurd in light of her courage and competence. Seagal continued, addressing both the administrator and the staff. "Skill, courage, and dedication cannot be ignored. She has proven herself time and time again, in ways most people will never understand. To question her ability, to dismiss her, is not just unfair, it's dangerous." The nurse stood taller, finally allowing herself to meet the eyes of the administrator directly. There was no anger, only a quiet, undeniable strength. She had endured humiliation, injustice, and doubt. But now, armed with the recognition of someone whose life she had saved, she had the moral authority the administrator could not challenge. And then came the turning point. Seagal turned to the staff, his voice steady but commanding. "She will continue her work here. No one will prevent that. No one will belittle her contributions again." The administrator's shoulders slumped. He realized that resistance was futile, not because of Seagal's presence alone, but because the truth, undeniable skill and courage, stood firmly on her side. There was nothing he could say, no argument that could reverse the tide. The audience watching the story unfold would feel the emotional weight of this confrontation. Justice was not handed down by policy or title. It was earned through bravery, competence, and integrity. The nurse's quiet heroism had prevailed, and the administrator's false authority had crumbled under the light of truth. Even as relief and vindication settled over the nurse, there was no room for complacency. The room still held the echoes of tension, a reminder that courage was not always recognized immediately, and injustice could linger. Yet in that moment, the scales had tipped. The nurse had not just saved a patient, she had reclaimed her dignity, restored faith in justice, and reminded everyone present that true authority comes from action, not position. And as Seagal nodded toward her, a silent acknowledgement passed between them, one of respect, recognition, and shared understanding. It was a quiet, powerful moment, a turning point that ensured everyone in the room, including the audience watching from afar, knew that the right thing had been done, and that bravery would always find its voice, even in the face of doubt. The tension in the ER began to lift as the reality of the situation settled over everyone present. The critically injured patient, now stable, lay under the careful watch of the nurse, who had finally been allowed to take full control of the room. The storm outside mirrored the chaos that had just unfolded inside, but slowly, as the rain softened against the windows, a sense of calm and justice began to take hold. The nurse straightened, her hands no longer trembling, her breath returning to a steady rhythm. She glanced around the room, seeing the faces of her colleagues, some sheepish, some respectful, and some in awe. The administrator, who had earlier wielded authority like a weapon, now stood quietly, unable to hide his embarrassment. It was clear that the tide had turned. Titles and hierarchy mattered little when the truth of skill, courage, and integrity could speak for itself. Steven Seagal approached the nurse, his calm demeanor still commanding attention. "You did exactly what was needed," he said, his voice carrying both respect and gratitude. "I've seen many people claim to be heroes, but you've proven it without ever asking for recognition. That's what makes a true professional and a true human being." The nurse felt a mix of relief, pride, and quiet satisfaction. All the humiliation, all the doubt, all the unfair accusations, it had been a test of resilience, and she had passed. Not through anger or confrontation, but through skill, courage, and unwavering commitment to what was right. Staff members began to gather around her, offering apologies, nods of respect, and even hesitant smiles. The younger nurses who had admired her quietly from afar finally voiced their appreciation aloud. "You've taught us all what it means to be brave," one whispered. Another added, "We wouldn't have survived the chaos tonight without you." The administrator, now humbled, stepped back. He realized that authority was not about shouting orders or instilling fear. It was about recognizing true talent and allowing it to flourish. In this room, the nurse's abilities had spoken louder than any title, and the lesson was clear. Outside, the storm began to ease. The rain slowed, sunlight breaking through the clouds, casting a warm glow into the ER. It was symbolic, a reminder that storms, both literal and metaphorical, eventually pass, and that justice, though delayed, can always arrive. As the nurse looked around at the room she had served for years, she felt a profound sense of closure. Today she had not only saved a life but restored respect, dignity, and fairness in a place that desperately needed it. The audience watching could feel the emotional weight of the moment, the triumph of truth over injustice, and the power of courage in the face of adversity. Seagal turned to the staff one last time. "Let this be a reminder: skill, integrity, and courage matter more than position or politics. Never forget that." His words lingered, echoing in the minds of everyone present, including the audience who had followed this story from start to finish. Before the camera faded, the nurse turned to address the viewers directly. Her voice, calm but strong, carried a quiet encouragement. "Stand up for what's right, even when the odds seem against you. Courage and skill will always be recognized in the end." And for those watching this story unfold, there was a simple way to honor the lessons it carried. Hit the like button if you believe in justice and courage. Comment below to share a moment when you stood up for what was right, and subscribe to follow more stories of real heroism and inspiration. Each action helps these stories reach those who need a reminder that bravery, honesty, and resilience always matter. As the final shots lingered on the nurse, strong, composed, and triumphant, the audience could feel the full arc of her journey. From humiliation to recognition, from doubt to validation, her story was a testament to perseverance and the quiet power of doing what is right, no matter how unfair the world may seem. The doors of the ER closed gently behind the scene, the room now quiet, and the storm outside fully cleared. And in that calm, everyone, staff, patient, and audience alike, knew that justice, courage, and truth had prevailed.